Hey guys, welcome to Ubuntu Server. Today we're going to take a look at a server operating system, specifically because we're going to build a mail server. And I know what a lot of you guys are probably thinking, why don't you just use O365? Well, because you got to pay for O365. Whereas with this, being that it's an open source platform, we're going to install a mail server that's free to run. Now, if you're following at home and you want to do the same thing, then realistically, you don't need a lot of processor or memory. You're just going to need a ton of storage. And since the mail server itself doesn't do any high I/O, realistically, that storage doesn't even have to be a solid-state drive. I would say your best bet for getting this to work correctly is probably anything that's newer than a 4th gen Intel i5 with at least 8 gigs of memory and probably at least 500 gigs of drive space. Now, I'm not going to run you through the step-by-step process of installing the server, just because it's exactly the same as the desktop, and we've done that multiple times already on this channel. Once you have your server built, you have your drive allocation configured, and you're up to the point where you can authenticate. Let's authenticate into the server for the first time. We're just going to enter in our username and then our password, and once we do that, we'll hit enter on our keyboard. Now, once you get to the point where you've actually authenticated into the system, you're going to see a variety of information on the screen. I'm not going to show all of that information because it does contain information on my system for my SD-WAN. With that said, let's get a bunch of stuff installed on the system so we can actually build out our mail server. To start with, we're going to run the same commands we would in the desktop. We're going to do sudo apt update and then sudo apt upgrade space -y. Once you do this, obviously, just like on the desktop, we're going to have to authenticate in order to access the sudo command. Once you do that, hit enter on the keyboard. Once that command completes, we're going to see on the bottom down here where we could see 19 packages can be upgraded. So we're going to do the same thing again, but we're going to change it to the upgrade. So on the keyboard, you can just hit the up arrow, change update to upgrade, then throw in a -y at the end so it doesn't prompt you every time it needs to upgrade every one of those 19 packages, and then just hit enter on the keyboard to continue. You got to note on the server, it's going to actually tell us that it suggests that we restart the system. However, it's not going to force us to restart the system, but we're going to do that anyway. So we're going to just type in sudo reboot now. Once you have that command entered, just hit enter on the keyboard to reboot your system. Once your system has rebooted, authenticate back into the system, and you should get to a flashing cursor like what we see here. Now, this part is optional, but I would suggest you install NetTools, which is just sudo apt install, and then it's net-tools. The reason why is this will give you the option to do an ifconfig on the system. So once you have it built, you can figure out what the IP address of the desktop is, as well as the MAC address information. For me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a DHCP reservation and not touch this and not make it static, so I could control the static reservation from my actual firewall and not have to mess around with the Linux system itself. And then simply, once you enter in sudo apt install NetTools, you'll get prompted for the sudo, enter in your password, and hit enter to continue. Okay, so now we have our prereqs installed. Now we're up to date. Let's install Citadel. Now, Citadel is a fully open source, and that's for commercial or private use actual mail server. It has a full GUI configuration. However, the installation is headless or through command line. Now, keep in mind, if you wanted a headed system to actually do the install, you could run Ubuntu Desktop. However, Ubuntu Server is a lot lighter weight, so if you're running older hardware, I would suggest running the server operating system. The command, as it's shown, is just curl space https://easyinstall.citadel.org/install space pipe space bash and hit enter. Now, if you notice, we get an error here, and there's a reason why. See, the documentation on the configuration doesn't tell you this, but I'm going to tell you that you have to sudo space -s to add the sudo command as root to allow you to actually install the application. Because even adding sudo in front of curl to run the actual command will still fail. So to fix this, we're just going to simply type in sudo space -s and hit enter. Get a note how the command configuration now changes what we see. We see the home and tour directory as the root directory. At this point, you're going to enter in the curl https easyinstall.citadel.org/install space pipe space bash and hit enter. Now, if you haven't figured this out already, you're going to need an internet connection in order to download the update packages onto your system. Now, I've already run through this a couple times on the latest version of Ubuntu, and it works without an issue, but you do have to follow the commands or the prompts that we see on the screen in order to do the install. So when prompted, we're going to hit Y for yes and hit enter. At this point, we're going to have to accept the terms of services. And I apologize for the choppiness of the screen. I'm trying to do this zoomed in so you can actually read the screen as we go along. At this point, either hit Y or type in yes and hit enter to continue. You'll notice that it's now going to ask us whether or not we want to install or attempt to install our OS dependencies. Now, if we're running the latest version of Ubuntu on a server platform, I can already tell you that the dependencies should install without any issue. So just hit Y again or type in yes and hit enter. You'll see at this point it's going to continue to download. Then once again it's going to prompt us to tell us it needs to use an additional amount of storage space to install these dependencies, and then once again ask us for Y or N, and we'll hit Y for yes to install it and then hit enter again. Just as a special note, it does say 88 megs of additional space for the archive, but the total operation is an additional 318 megs. While the installation is relatively straightforward, it isn't the fastest, so just be patient while it downloads and installs your configuration. Okay, so once the installation is semi-complete, we'll get to a point in the installation which will change to a configuration. Now, during the configuration, it's going to ask you a series of questions. The first one is it's going to ask you to name the local administrator account for the Citadel application. So in other words, what do you want to use as your authentication account to get into the application itself? Default is admin with a lowercase a. It's important to keep that in mind because Linux is case sensitive on the username as well. On mine, I'm going to change it to capital GTS for GenericTechSupport, and then I'm going to hit enter. By default, it's not going to set a password. So if you want to use no password to authenticate on your first time logging in, just leave it blank and hit enter. However, if you want to enter a password so that way you have to authenticate to get into the actual mail server, which I would strongly suggest, enter in a password now so that way you could set up a password to log in with your new user account or new admin account. Now, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to show you what I entered in as the password. However, password's been set on this particular system. At this point, Citadel is going to ask us to set up a service account. I would strongly suggest you create a service account and don't allow the actual account to run under root, and then use whatever you want for it. I'm going to use GTS service for generic tech support service on the actual configuration, and then I'm going to hit enter. Now, I stated earlier in the configuration that what I was going to do is I was going to use the DHCP on my firewall to configure the actual static address on my server. However, if you're not going to do that, you're going to configure the static IP address on the actual Ubuntu server. You'll need to have set that first and then define that IP address here for your listening port for your configuration. However, if you just leave it as the default, which is an asterisk, which is listed on any IP address on the system, assuming you only have a single IP address on the server, that'll work too. And at which point you would just hit enter here. So this part is a little tricky and it depends on how you're going to configure the server. Now, by default, it's port 504. You could make that port any port that you want to make as long as it's not used by another protocol. For this configuration, I'm going to leave it as the default, but if you're going to run multiple servers, as it states here, you're going to need to create like 504, 505, 506, and then use some kind of NAT-based configuration in your firewall to actually route the traffic properly to the specific port numbers. Otherwise, you'll end up with conflict or collision. For our configuration, we're going to leave it as the default and then just hit enter. Just keep in mind, obviously, the configuration that I'm showing on the screen is just a default configuration for a lab. If you're going to do this configuration, I would suggest using customized ports and everything else to make sure that you can maintain the security of the actual mail server. Okay, so the next value here that we're going to have an option to change is going to be how we're going to set up authentication. So, for instance, if you're using like an LDAP configuration, for instance, Microsoft Active Directory, you would choose number 3 here and then do the configuration for AD auth. If you're using a host system, so integrated authentication, which is usually like a flat file configuration, at which point then you would just choose the system integrated authentication, which is number 1. You could use POSIX or POSIX, the schema, and then use number 2, which is usually Linux or Unix-based LDAP configuration versus Microsoft, which is slightly different. At least I think it's post 2003 R2. In the 2008 server, it changed. However, if you're running before that, like 2003 R2 or something like that, then you could use number 2 as well. Number 0 is what we're going to choose here, just because we're going to use the self-contained authentication, because we're going to just configure this as a standalone system. At that point, I'm just going to hit enter. So here is where we could create customized ports. So if you want to use like 8080 for HTTP and then maybe 8443 for your customized secure port for HTTPS, this is where you can do it. For me, it doesn't really make any difference. I'm just going to leave it as the default, which is just 80 and 443, and then hit enter. So choose 80 for HTTP, and then I'll hit enter to continue. And then I'm going to do 443 for HTTPS, and then I'm going to hit enter to continue. Okay guys, so at this point, our configuration is done. But we did install NetTools earlier, so we could use an ifconfig command at this point to pull back the IP address of the system. Okay, so once I have the IP address of my server figured out, all I have to do is go into a browser, type in https:// and then do the whatever your IP address is. So 192.168.1. Whatever, or whatever you have as your configuration for your IP. At that point, you'll get prompted that you don't have a certificate. You'll have to choose to advance anyway. This is going to be normal as long as you don't have a cert. It's not required to have a cert, but if you do, then obviously you won't get that prompt. Once you get to this point, what you can do is you can put in your username and your password, which we created earlier in this video, and then hit login. Now, once you're logged into the system, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see the summary view of the actual configuration. But it's important to keep in mind that the page that we're actually looking at this point is actually the web portal, meaning that what you're logging into is actually webmail. This webmail view that we see right now, however, is slightly advanced in that we're seeing it from the administrative side. The users won't see this, and you could customize specifically what you want the users to see in this list. Maybe you don't want certain things to run. Maybe you want to add things to it. You could do that through this list. Again, the operating system's open source, and so is the application, meaning that you could customize this any way you'd really like. And while I could go through every single one of these menus and we could touch base on what every single one of these things does, I don't think it's really necessary for the type of person that's going to watch this video and be interested in doing the configuration. So for you, I'm going to tell you that really all you have to do is go to the administration tab. And once you're in the administration tab, really where you want to go is to the edit site-wide configuration and click on that link. From here, this is where you're going to do all of your mail configuration. So this is going to be your general, your settings, your SMTP, your IMAP, your POP, setting up your indexing or journaling, setting up access, setting up your directory configuration, setting up your auto purgers. So if you want to delete certain amounts of messages or whatever at night, maybe you want to get rid of all spam that after 7 days or 14 days or something like that, you could do a policy configuration here to do it. Automate it. Under the general tab also, this is where you're going to do your change in login logo or logout logo. So if you want to change the Citadel to your company logo, you do it through here. You can just click on either one of those things and then hit save changes. Another location under the administration tab that may be helpful for you as an admin going into the system is the ability to see the outbound SMTP queue. So if something's stuck and not actually sending, you can see it through here. Your domain names and internet mail configuration. So if you go in here, you could actually do configurations in here as well. This is where you would add your ability to set up like a ClamAV, so a server that scans everything with antivirus, or Spam Assassin configuration. Generally speaking, these two would probably be on the same box. You just add that on there. And then you could scan your mail. You could also scan it with spam filtering, which gives you the ability to run this as a full-fledged mail application on your internal infrastructure. So the configuration of this obviously is fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward of initially getting it set up to the point where we could get to this logon screen. Something else that I will point out is the use case of this. Now, this is great for somebody that's a home user, but it's also great for a business user. And there's a reason why I say this, because ultimately the cloud isn't for everyone. The cloud works great for certain use cases, but it's not a one-stop shop or one-stop answer to every problem. Are you being told by your managed service provider that you have to go to the cloud? Reach out to ColumbusTechAudit. Their advanced security team will review your contract and make sure that's really the best solution for what you need. Don't become one of the statistics of the thousands of companies that went under going to Microsoft Azure. Reach out to them today. So let me know down in the comments, guys. What do you think about the Citadel server? Are you guys going to try it out? Do you think as a home user or a small business, Azure makes more sense? Again, let me know in the comments. I'm really interested in hearing your feedback. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching the Generic Tech Support YouTube channel. Check out the content of this video and a lot more technical resources at https://generictechsupport.com/#channel.